Hello, everyone. How's everyone doing? Welcome to our Thursday wine meditation at Chimney Rock. Um, I might be a little distracted today. We've had a very busy day here, so harvest has officially begun. And today we completed basically all of our whites. So we finished harvesting earlier this week. And then today we're barreling down and adding yeast, and we had a very, very busy day. So I've just had to transition from working mode to speaking mode, different kind of work. But I'm thrilled to report the whites look absolutely beautiful this year, really excited. And we are actually bringing back Élevage Blanc in 2020. So it's our first vintage after we had to replant some of that vineyard that we're bringing Élevage Blanc back. So we're very excited about that. And let's catch up a little bit on harvest. I know a lot of people are seeing news about the fires in wine country, so I wanted to give my personal update for us. Fortunately, everyone here is safe and our property is safe. It has been a very trying few weeks. Needless to say, we have many friends who have not been as fortunate. They've been evacuated and haven't been able to reach their wineries, and it's been pretty tumultuous. But I think you guys know I'm sort of a glass half full kind of gal, and I think Napa Valley has been known to survive some pretty tough things in the past. In fact, this week was our 6th year anniversary from the earthquake in 2014, which we lived through. And we've certainly had fires. And here at Chimney Rock, we actually had fires very close to the property in 2017. So we are not novices to all of this. And we feel relatively prepared. And I think we're very even-tempered when it comes to managing the stress of it, because it's become a part of our reality in some ways. So thinking good thoughts for all of our friends out there who are still dealing with the challenges of the fire, and containment is on its way. The air is much better here right now, which is all great news. And hopefully we'll get this behind us very quickly. So with that, we have not started harvesting any of our reds. So reds are still on the vine, and we are currently just finishing up our whites, and hopefully in about a week or two, we've got a lot of cleaning to do still in the winery before we're ready to go with reds. We'll be doing that, some more prep in the cellar. I'm doing a lot of vineyard walking, spending a lot of time in the vineyards, and hopefully we'll be there very soon. So we are going to do a tasting of two very special wines today. So occasionally, actually not occasionally, every year it has been our practice to play with experimenting different techniques, different barrels, for as long as I've been here, certainly. You know, I really believe that winemaking it's by nature, you can't sort of arrive at a place and say, I know how to do it. It really is trying different things, responding to different seasons, and every year there's room for improvisation. And improvisation can be a great thing, right? In comedy, you can always sometimes find this amazing creative moment. And I think the same goes for winemaking. Sometimes we try things that work out. Sometimes we try things that work out amazingly. Sometimes we try things that don't work out so well. But back in 2011, I started playing with a little technique which I learned from a friend who had worked in New Zealand. And the technique was that when you drain a red fermenter off the skins, typically what we do is we drain it during the day. So we pull that freshly made wine off of the skins. That's the free run. It now is ready to go to barrel. But in a 12-ton fermenter, if we put a little sump collecting overnight, what comes out is about enough for a barrel, I mean. And so in New Zealand, this was nicknamed the egg of the tank. In other words, the last 60 gallons that drain very slowly from the tank are constitute the egg of the barrel. And my friend who had worked there said, oh my God, they use this technique. They keep the barrels separate. They're beautiful. So we started playing with that in 11. And you may have heard me talk about this technique relating to Omega Point, which we have certainly used as part of the blend there. But the wines we're tasting today are 2 single barrels. And by the way, we've nicknamed our technique the pearl of the tank, not the egg of the tank. We like the term pearl because it really is a very special fraction of that particular tank. And so we started doing these in 11. In 14, we bottled 2 single barrels, which are the pearl of the tank, of one of our Tomahawk lots and one of our Ganymede lots. So talk a little bit about vintage first. So 2014, of course, another drought year, 13, 14, 15. So Mother Nature helping us along. Not a lot of spring or summer rain at all. Actually quite dry. We were in a drought, which gives us great concentration, great ripeness, probably one of the earliest harvests that we've had, along with 15 and 13. And to kind of give you an idea, Ganymede that year was harvested on September 29th, and Tomahawk was harvested on October 2nd. So that is very early. Traditionally, we're harvesting those blocks at the end of October. So that kind of gives you an idea of what kind of season it was. But what I love about the 14s is they have a real approachability, even though they are drought years, which can be a little bit austere. These wines between 13, 14, and 15, to me, are the most approachable at a young age. So we thought we would share this. We only bottled of each of these wines 24 cases. That's it. So it's about 280 bottles of each. But that vineyard, those vineyards perform well every year, right? You know, our famous Ganymede vineyard, Tomahawk vineyard. And what's the difference here? This is really selecting kind of the barrel, the best barrel from that single vineyard. So, you know, people ask me, like, what's the difference between doing blends versus a single vineyard versus a wine like this, which I almost call a unicorn wine, right? Because it's so rare. So a blend, I think musically a little bit about this stuff. So think of a blend as like a symphony, right? It's an orchestra, it's a choir. You've got all these forces coming together to create something that's cohesive, harmonious. It takes a lot to put that together so that it's super balanced and a great wine on its own. A single vineyard, I almost think of as maybe it's like a trio, right? So a trio of musicians, because you're taking one vineyard, but you are blending in different components from different barrels. So it's a blend of sorts, although it's only telling the tale of that vineyard. These wines are like, I think of a solo cellist on the stage, right? It's totally focused. One barrel, one vineyard, just very, very narrow. And there's a real purity to showing, I think, a dimension of our vineyards this way. So I think we're going to get started tasting. As usual, what I'd like to do is to have you guys ask questions towards the end of the tasting that are more general about winemaking. Again, you have a winemaker at your disposal here. You can ask anything you want, anything you're curious about at Chimney Rock. But I'm going to tell you 2 more things about the 2 vineyards in case you weren't familiar. And I'm going to pull my map up here. So Chimney Rock's about a half a mile from north to south end. The north end is closer to the Palisades outcroppings, the massive outcroppings in the Vaca Mountains. The south end is a little bit cooler, farther away from the Palisades, so not quite as warm. So we see, I think of Ganymede and Tomahawk as literally the yin and yang of our estate, the north being riper, more opulent because it's closer to a warm spot, the southern part being a little bit more cool climate personality, and it has more layers of maybe herbs. It might have brighter acidity, and it The tone of the fruit is different. So traditionally, to me, Ganymede is very black fruit in nature. So think blackberries, black cherry. Whereas the south end, where Tomahawk is more red fruit in nature. So more plums, maybe raspberries, maybe cherries. So they really have a different personality. And you're going to see that really clearly in these wines. So we're going to start with Ganymede, which again was harvested on September 29th. And that is, I mean, it's just pure blackberry. And these wines, so another sort of fun thing to point out about these wines before we even taste them is they're now 6 years old. So traditionally we're doing these tastings, we're doing a lot of current releases. With this, we've aged for about 6 years before we're even releasing it, which I think is sort of great because we've aged it in perfect cellar conditions. And we're releasing it just as it gets, to me, to that sweet spot. These are actually a little young because it's a big vintage, but to me, that 6 to 12 year is where you start to get wines to be really more complex, because you start to get, maybe you've got all the freshness of the fruit, but you're starting to get some development, some maturation in the tannins, so they're a little bit more supple and approachable. So going back to Ganymede, oodles of black fruit and some mocha there. I use a really special barrel, and I use the same kind of barrel for both, so that you're comparing exactly apples to apples except for the vineyard. So they both got a brand new barrel from a cooper named Sylvain. And Sylvain makes these barrels that come from trees that are a little bit older. So typically more fine grain, a little bit more soft and approachable. And we use those barrels. They're super special. And so the mocha kind of character, kind of cocoa I'm seeing here really makes me think of kind of the oak character. A little bit of floral, like almost like a dried flower, violet sort of aroma. Really, really beautiful. And I'm going to take a sip. And that is just super rich. It's very polished. I always think of Ganymede as very elegant, very graceful, even though it's 100% Cabernet. And some of the oldest vines on our property, so those vines are close to 30 years of age. It just always has this elegance and this grace. It's powerful, but it has grace. So the tannins, although it's a young wine, you know, it's drinkable now. It sort of clamors for food to me because it's sort of very rich and just has a lot going on. But I love having this singular moment where you just look at the wine. You take away all stimulus and you can just see kind of the purity of the Ganymede. So I'm curious as to the ones of you who have both of these wines. I can't wait to hear what you think of both. So let's go to Tomahawk. Again, southern end of the property. This vineyard's a little older. It was planted when the Trovato family developed the estate. So it is now a, let's see, 18-year-old vineyard. So not so young, but so it's got, and it's been producing extraordinary fruit since 2006, which was our first vintage of Tomahawk Vineyard. So I'm going to smell this. And this is the meditation moment, guys. This is where you're supposed to forget the rest of the world and everything you worry about and just think about the wine. And that is truly, to me, it's cherry and it's plums. It's funny, the mocha is not quite as emphatic as it is in the Ganymede. There's a little bit there from the barrel as well. And so if I were to talk about the key differences between these two wines, it's going to be sort of the fruit notes that we see in them and the structure. And I'll tell you about that in a second. I'm going to take a taste. Yeah, so Tomahawk to me is a little bit more austere. It's not quite as pretty. It's a little bit more rustic. It kind of says cool climate a little bit more to me. The acidity is a little bit brighter in the finish. There's a really nice lift in the finish. but they're equally, they just are equally thought-provoking to me. And I also see in Tomahawk some of those herbal notes that I love from the south end of our state. So there's what I would call maybe almost like a bay leaf, maybe, and I get just a hint, like really, like it really is a very slight hint of what I call sort of a wet stone, which is, or wet gravel, which is something that you can see in Cabernets as they start to develop, especially in cool climate to me. And I see that here, and I love that aroma. I think it's just so beautiful. And we often joke with our club members and our fans that you're either a Ganymede person or you're a Tomahawk person. It seems like people are divided that way. But I'm neither. I think they're equally magnificent, very powerful Cabernet. They tell different stories. I mean, these are really special bottles, guys, that, 200 and something bottles made. So I love being able to have the ability to make that decision and say, you know what, let's just bottle that barrel. And that's a real privilege as a winemaker to say, this is really extraordinary, let's do that. And we've done these unfiltered a couple of times, and when we called it unfiltered because it really is a single barrel and it isn't filtered, but many of our wines are not filtered also. It was more in the sense of like focus and like the purity of the wine. But I think if you were to taste it side by side with the regular Ganymede, and I hate using the word regular because Ganymede is nothing close to regular, or Tomahawk, I think you would see a difference. I think there's a depth and there's a textural difference. I think oftentimes that pearl of the tank is actually a little bit more supple, believe it or not. And my theory about that, I'm not sure that I have a theory. Maybe it's, imagine the fermenter and you're draining wine out of there for, 14 hours overnight. Gravity is very gently pressing on those skins. And so it's almost like the lightest pressing that gravity could do. And it has almost like a viscosity or like a syrupy texture to it that's different from the rest of the lot. So I'm thrilled to share these, and it was really exciting to actually be able to share it with you guys today. Now, as far as the ageability on these wines, ton of time. You do not have to drink this today. Hopefully you maybe opened one or saving the other. Maybe you saved both because they are pretty special wines. And I think these are wines, to be kept for 10, if you have the patience and if you resist it, for 10 or 15 or 20 years. So if you hadn't tried our unfiltereds, know that we don't make them every year. So we made a little bit in 13. I believe we've done a Clone 7. We've done a Tomahawk unfiltered, but they only happen occasionally. So when you hear about them, I really think they're sort of worth checking into. I want to do a little toast because I know David Bertree, you have a big birthday today, sir. So Lisa and Dave, I'm raising a glass to Dave, wishing you a great new decade. And I'm so glad that you guys are celebrating with us tonight. I miss you guys, and hope to see you soon. So cheers, guys. That was a little aside. Anyway, I think we can kind of go into question mode if we've got some questions.
Well, I think you already covered a little bit of the difference between the change in character when you filter wine versus not filter it. Right?
Difference between filtering and not filtering. I think that's a good conversation. So it's mainly a textural thing and a clarity thing. We have a little machine that we can measure how clear a wine is. If you don't filter it, it tends to be a little cloudier, right? So it looks a little different. Filtration can be a great thing. Sometimes wines, and we do a very light filtration if we do. It's just what I call a polished filtration. It's not a sterile filtration. Sterile is very tight pores that your wine goes through, and so you really trying to do something preventing any microbial activity, we don't usually do that. So we just do what I call a polish filtration. And I think the main difference that you'll see is kind of texture. The unfiltered wines will have more richness. Now, of course, there's always advantages and disadvantages to the two things. And occasionally, if you buy one of our wines, even in youth, you'll see them throw a little bit of sediment early. And that's one of the disadvantages of not filtering. You may get some of that precipitation of tannin and color, and it comes out. And my recommendation for that is if you're drinking an unfiltered wine, stand it up for a couple of days before you're going to have it. So if it was stored laying down, stand it up about 48 hours or even a little bit longer before you consume it, and then decant. Decant and leave the sediment at the bottom. There's no harm in the sediment, that it doesn't cause anything, but it can be a little chunky on the palate, and it's not particularly pleasant. But I do think there's a benefit to not filtering sometimes, because in a sense, there's to me a deeper purity in a wine that isn't filtered. So we go on a case-by-case basis. It's really like we have no formulas on how we make wine, but if I can go unfiltered, that's usually my preference. Yeah.
And we have several folks drinking the same vintage of the filtered version of, so 2014 Ganymede. I think people are tasting some Tomahawk too, and it occurred to me, do you guys do the same barrels for,
Yeah, so the broader vineyard designate will have a variety of barrels and coopers, right? So that already is adding a different component. This has one barrel, and the way I think about barrels is it's a little bit like spices in the kitchen, right? So you might add a little clove, a little bit of cinnamon, some vanilla. When you have a diversity of barrels, you're adding a little bit more diversity in that. Whereas this is that particular cooper makes barrels in a certain way, and from Sylvain's I always get a lot of cocoa, mocha. Those are kind of the tones that I love. So if I were to compare this probably to Tomahawk and Ganymede single vineyard, I think the nose would be different because of that diversity of oak that's there. I think the texture would also be a little bit different because it's not that last 60 gallons. So this may be a little bit more viscous and almost syrupy, whereas the others are rich, but they don't have sort of that powerful weight. So those are kind of some of the differences that we see. Mm-hmm. Hi, Ken Tolchin. Aw. Hi, Tom Short. So David Hamrick says, I've heard wine described as chewy, same as chunky, chewy. I would say those are kind of denoting the same thing. Yeah, it's when you have a fair amount of tannin and it feels, it's a real textural thing. Like it's almost like, okay, I'm almost like, it's like I have a piece of chocolate in my mouth, So I think it would be used similarly. I almost use chewy in a good way. Like I think chewy is a good thing. Chunky is when it starts to get perhaps too drying, or I might use drying and chunky. But chewy to me is delicious. Chewy is when a Cabernet has a lot of body and a lot of oomph. So, all right. Hello from Louisiana, and you guys survived the hurricane. So yeah, we have all sorts of cataclysmic things going on all over the country. So thank God for wine, right? It really allows us to have a minute to put the reality away.
And a non-exactly wine-related question. Dave McMurtry actually is visiting next week, and he asked about our tastings, in COVID, and so I thought it was a good time to mention.
Yeah, it's always good to give you guys an update. Our tasting room, fortunately, is open. We are allowed to have tastings outside in California. Because of COVID, we cannot taste in private rooms because of social distancing. But as you guys know, we have a beautiful outdoor space, so we're able to host tastings outside. And we are open. You can call and make it. It must be by reservation. That's really important. because we're limited to how many people we can see on a given day, particularly Saturdays, which tend to be our busiest day. So call in advance, and we are open. And the weather this week is actually lovely. We did a little bit of smoke last week, but it's sort of eased up, so the air quality is much better today.
So you said in the cellar you guys are cleaning and getting ready, and then typically what varietal or what block would you anticipate will be ready for next?
Yeah, so tell you guys a little bit about harvest activities and how we kind of go about them. So Laura Orozco, my assistant, and I are spending a lot of time. We go out there with Ziploc baggies and we pull berry samples, random berry samples off the grapevines, and we're tasting a lot of grapes to kind of see what the ripeness is like, what the tannins and the skins are like. We look at the seeds. So when seeds are browner, that means they're riper. When they're green, that means they're not ripe yet. So these are all things that we're going to take into account in deciding when to pick. We then bring that berry sample back to our little lab, and we measure sugar and pH and acidity. And those numbers don't really make us decide when to pick, but they're a guideline of where we are in development. I smell and taste the juices. We make a little juice out of that berry sample, and that sort of is our guideline. So once that magical day arrives, we call our farming company, and usually they can pick within 24 hours of what we schedule. So the order of picking usually is what we just did was our Sauvignon Blanc and our Sauvignon Gris. Sauvignon Gris is actually first, then Sauvignon Blanc. And then we usually, there's a little break before the reds start to come through. And so first one is always our Merlot on the hillside. We have a hillside Merlot, very warm spot. Typically this goes into élevage, and that's the first one to come in. Then let's see, we have a couple of hillside cabs, and believe it or not, there are a couple of cabs that come in early because they're on hillsides, they're a little bit more exposed. So we'll pick the Clone 7, Cardiac Hill, and Alpine traditionally. Not to say that that order is absolute every year. Mother Nature does play tricks on us, and you really have to watch season to season because there are changes. And then typically we'll finish off Merlot. So our other Merlot blocks ripen a little after those hillsides. Then we move into Cab Franc, a little Petit Verdot, usually maybe another cab or two somewhere in there. South Hill, part of the South Hill block is kind of on a hillside, so it ripens a little early. And then it kind of goes, the rest of the property, when all the cab is suddenly there, is kind of north to south, like a domino effect. So we kind of start in Clone 4, go to Ganymede, and we just go all the way south to Tomahawk. And Tomahawk is typically the last block to ripen, and that kind of makes sense, right? It's the coolest spot on the ranch. So it does exactly what we've been watching it, and the climate is definitely sort of a good way to predict who's going to come in first. So those are kind of the guidelines on how ripeness happens.
Mm-hmm. So I think we just have time for David's question, and then we'll let people know when they can see us again.
Okay, and David's question was?
It's just overall for harvest, are you thinking like, lower yields, higher concentration? Yeah. Do you have any expectations?
So let's talk a little bit about 2020. So we think the crop is much smaller in 20 than 18 and 19, which were quite generous. We had a little bit of funky weather when the grapevines were flowering, and that causes what we call shatter, which means some of the flowers that are meant to become grapes don't become grapes. And so the clusters on Cabernet in particular are very loose. So smaller crop. I think in terms of picking time, I think it's going to be earlier than 18 and 19, which were much cooler years. We were sort of tracking behind those years, and then we sort of caught up. So we had a little heat spike, so very cool July, and we were thinking, we've got time, and then we got some heat in August, which has kind of moved things along a little quicker. So I would say lower than average yields is my prediction. In terms of quality, it's been a really great dry spring, so very small berry, less yield, I think is going to result in a lot of intensity and great quality. So we'll get through this, and that's it. Our expectation is very good for harvest this year, thus far. And I'm going to knock on wood because Mother Nature can play lots of tricks on us. So that's it. So I am going to do one more tasting before harvest really gets going. So September 10th, we'll be doing one last tasting. I believe we're going to maybe do a Clone 7, Clone 4 comparison, which will be great. Those are 2 single vineyards, different clones of Cabernet that are quite remarkable. So we'll taste those 2. And then I'm going to go on hiatus from our live tastings for a little bit so I can actually go make wine in the cellar. But we are going to try to bring some live stuff, maybe on Instagram, where I take you guys to the crush pad. Laura and I will tank taste, and you guys can follow us around. So we're going to try to do some real candid, on the ground, behind the scenes, so you guys can sort of experience harvest with me from afar if you can't make it out this year. So with that, I'm going to raise a glass to you all, say thank you again so much for joining me all the time for these tastings. It's as much meditative for me as it hopefully is for you. So we really appreciate your support. Thank you so much. Stay safe and cheers.